Hey American Lit folks, this is going to be our week 3 informational video. I'm going to talk about what is due and what the expectations are for this week, but also just touch base about a few things that I made notes about, so forgive me for addressing my notes. I was noticing in your discussion posts recently, which are awesome. I've enjoyed so much looking through those and just looking at your ideas and seeing how wonderfully you are responding to one another and just thinking about things in really great and interesting ways, smart ways too. So that's been wonderful. And I've noticed a couple of themes kind of develop in your interest for the paper topic. Many of you mentioned enslavement and information about U.S. enslavement, which we just haven't been taught well enough if we went through schools in the U.S., high schools in the U.S. Some of you talked about enslavement just in terms of what you have learned and maybe what we kind of need to fill in the gaps on, especially because U.S. enslavement was very different from enslavement in other areas. Even though a lot of people talk about, well, the Greeks and Romans enslaved folks and different tribes in Africa enslaved individuals. Slavery in the U.S. developed in a very distinct manner. This is where we really start seeing in history discussions about race and racial identity and how, based on race, white scientists, white individuals started to create this idea of superiority of white identity and white racial identity as being superior to other identities, which is a justification, right, for enslavement. In the U.S. Also, enslavement in the U.S. looked very different than enslavement elsewhere because in different times throughout history, victors in wars or skirmishes would take the losers, essentially those who weren't the victors, and enslave those individuals, but often they would be a part of the household in a way. Yes, they were enslaved, but they were not treated in nearly the same way that African and later African American individuals were treated in the U.S., but also thinking about slavery in the Caribbean, which was on sugar plantations. Slavery was brutal in a much different kind of way than the brutality of a lot of cotton and tobacco farms in the U.S. So slavery was something that really developed in a distinct way in the U.S. And that is something that we are still reckoning with clearly. Clearly, if we look at the political and the social climate right now in relation to police brutality and Black Lives Matter and the protests going on, there is a reason that they have developed in such a way, and that's related to our history of enslavement, right, and the specific kind of enslavement in the U.S. Also religion. Some of you were talking about religion and your interest there. And you can see there's a lot of crossover between enslavement and religion as well, because a lot of white enslavers and those people who were supportive of enslavement in the U.S. who were white, right, used religion as justification again for enslavement, right? If you look at biblical texts, you'll see connections to enslavement. Again, enslavement there does not look the same as the U.S. Developed it, right? And the white folks in the U.S. developed it. But religion overall, just in American literature, it becomes just a huge part of American history, right? So I saw that some of you were interested in that, as well as Native American identities, literatures, and developments throughout history, right? That is something that, again, much like enslavement, we just haven't learned about a lot. And that says a lot about the texts that we use in the U.S. when it comes to history and literature. We still have texts that exist that talk about enslavement as, people were not slaves, they were workers, right? And they were happy workers. Don't get me started on that, y'all. So many problems there. But we see some of those same problems applied to what we know and understand about Native American history, and just the variation about different tribal identities and the different literatures, and just the culture that is developed within each area and each region. And some of you were also talking about things like the Enlightenment. Another one is, some of you were thinking about language and how language has shifted and changed over time. That's very fascinating. And a lot of literary scholars are really into that, a lot of linguistics. So there's a lot that you can dig into when it comes to your paper topics, right? I want to make a quick note about MLA, and just to remind you, I have posted a video about the basics of MLA formatting when it comes to quoting and citations. Please don't forget those page numbers, and please make sure you're citing things properly. So there are various links in addition to that video. Also, I want us to, in our discussion posts, kind of make sure that we're moving away from overgeneralization. In our posts, we want to get down to the point. So you don't have to, as you would in a general kind of introductory paragraph, lead into your ideas. Just get into them, right? Just get right into whatever we're analyzing or summarizing, and start your discussion. We don't have to worry about the overgeneralization. Okay, we want to get specific. Also, make sure that we're focusing on capitalization, capitalizing if you're using I, the first person, if you're capitalizing people's names or text titles. Just make sure you're paying attention to some of those things so you're not losing out on points for your discussion posts because of some of them. Sorry, I keep moving around my back. My back is in pain right now. Make sure that if you're referencing titles of different readings that they're in quotation marks or italics if you're referring to our course text. So some of that is in the MLA video, so just double check that. Grades, some of you have had questions about grades. I'm going to be working to make sure that those are updated. Once you see your grade, if you have a question or concern about that grade, it's going to be best to meet during office hours, so from 12 to 1:30 Monday through Thursday in the instant message feature of D2L, or we can set up a WebEx face-to-face meeting. I can't really talk too much about grades via email just for security purposes, so that's something to keep in mind. But from what I'm seeing right now and the grades that I've assessed so far, the points are usually, if you're losing points, it's because you may not be attending to each different aspect of the prompt. So you get really excited and write a lot about the first question in the prompt, but maybe neglect the second or third question. Or there are surface level issues, right? The spelling, the grammar. That's why I really encourage you to compose your work in Microsoft Word to take advantage of the grammar and spell check features there. They're not perfect, right? They're not perfect, but there's something to start with. And then you can also save your work in file format to address later for the paper topic portfolio. So you have that in one single place. Okay. Give me 1 second. I'm looking at my notes. Okay, so also the last thing is that we're going to be moving from the idea of summaries into analysis. So there will be times when I just say, hey, offer a straight summary, right? But then if I'm asking for analysis, make sure you're pushing your ideas and not relying solely on the summaries, right? So analysis means really digging into the content and the meaning and the historical implications or the literary implications of what we're reading about, right? And these are things that we just may not have done in a while. So we're practicing, we're working on that, and my grading will reflect that I know that we're working through some of this, okay? If you have any questions about this or any other information, always feel free to post in the Q&A portion of D2L or to send me an email, right? Or you can meet during office hours. I do want to pull up our schedule for this week, and I want to note that there is an error in the page numbers, right? So when we come to the reading for Sunday's paper discussion post, paper topic discussion post, right? It's 820, page 820 to 823. So just something to keep in mind. That's my error, and I apologize for that. But we are really digging into some ideas of the origins of enslavement in the U.S. with our reading. So we have our writing journal this week will be about Phyllis Wheatley. First African-American to be published in the U.S. She wrote a lot of poetry early on, right? Very incredible figure, historically controversial in some ways. So if you look at the paper or the writing journal post, I've offered some information about that. And then for our reading on Friday, you'll be reading the narrative written by Olaudah Equiano. Some of you may be familiar with his writing, some of you may not. It is an enslaved narrative, right? So that becomes kind of a genre in American literature. So two just incredible figures in her early history that we may not be super familiar with. For the paper topic discussion this week, y'all, I do have to admit, let me look you eye to eye. I have a problem with Thomas Jefferson. Okay, so I'm having you read Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia alongside David Walker's Appeal. And I want you to think about the fact that they are both controversial figures for various reasons. Walker is indeed responding to Jefferson and Jefferson's highly racist ideas. A lot of times when we talk about Thomas Jefferson, it is the usual founding father, author of the Declaration of Independence, very influential figure in US history. What we maybe don't talk about enough, and we maybe haven't learned at all in our history classes or literature classes, is how deeply problematic he is as a figure. And we'll see some of that in Notes on the State of Virginia. So for some of you, it may behoove you to prepare yourself to read this and to find Jefferson a problematic figure. But again, part of our class is filling in some of those gaps. That's why we're reading the things that we are, to make sure that we have that well-rounded view of how American history and literature developed. Walker is equally controversial, but for different reasons. He is calling for violent resistance, right? He is a black a black man living in the US at the time, after Jefferson a bit, but he is responding to Jefferson's writing. He was not an enslaved individual. He is one of those rare black individuals in the US who is not enslaved. But I want us to think about, if we haven't heard of David Walker, why? Why is he a figure that we haven't heard about or read about in our classes? And again, that goes into the politics of who writes the history texts that we read in high school and college, who writes the literature texts, why are some voices not included? David Walker, like Phyllis Wheatley, and even Equiano, but to a lesser extent, these are figures who were reclaimed during the Black Power movement, the Black nationalist movement, because they are figures that are seen through a lens of resistance. Even though Wheatley has been criticized as being somebody who conformed to white identity and standards and white expectations, she was still a Black woman at this time who published her work. It's incredible, right? And David Walker is certainly seen as a figure early on that is in a lot of ways related to somebody like Malcolm X, right? Forming this notion of resistance by any means necessary, which is, Malcolm X quote. Those are definitely two Black male figures who are, I think, misunderstood in our history books and in our conversations. So it helps us to get to the source of those ideas. So we're going to read those in relation to one another for our paper topic. Okay. So some things to think about. Jefferson is also controversial when it comes to Wheatley. He was really dismissive of her work, and a lot of people, including Jefferson, weren't so sure that she wrote the texts, right? Because of course a Black woman couldn't write these texts in this time. Whew, y'all, don't get me started. So when we think about this, that's where we're going with our work this week. So we have an MLA basics video that you can take some time to look at just as a review. A lot of us have some experience with MLA. There's also the PowerPoint that I go over in this video, and an MLA handout, just so that you can refresh your memories. Again, in Wheatley, right, I want you to think about her text for that writing journal. So take some time to read through that. And then for your reading response, that's when we go to Equiano, who we may not know Equiano at all compared to Phyllis Wheatley, right? So we have some different guidelines in looking at their texts and kind of not only summarizing, but then again, pushing our ideas and working towards analysis, okay? And then we get to the paper topic. You may not see this when you look at this week's breakdown, but it will be visible on Wednesday. That's when the paper topics will be posted. So we have the background reading that's called Slavery, Race, and the Making of American Literature. That's giving us a little bit of that historical context about not only society and history at the time, but also literature. And then we get into Jefferson and Walker. So I'm really in this section kind of offering some, this could be difficult reading for us, but I want us to question why. Why would this be difficult for us to read? For those of us who are maybe resisting this notion of Thomas Jefferson as a problematic figure, why are we resistant to that? These are, I think, incredibly important conversations for us to have right now, like I said, because we're talking about taking down statues that are Confederate heroes, right? We're talking about, what do we need to grapple with in our history in the US? Things that we haven't grappled with before. A lot of the conversation about those Confederate statues, a lot of people who are supportive or, pro keeping them up are looking at it from this historical perspective without understanding that a lot of those statues were put up during the civil rights movement to inspire and instill fear in people who were protesting and a part of the civil rights movement. So we have this really shaky ground to stand on when it comes to looking at those those monuments as being, reflective of a history, and, looking at the Confederacy as resistance to a government that was trying to impose its will on states and states' rights. Everything comes down to this notion of how we're viewing history. The Confederate War was fought not necessarily about states' rights, but states' rights to own slaves, right? So we have a lot of grappling with to do, whether you look like me or you don't look like me as a white individual. We have some grappling and some history to maybe consider, right? So I'm really looking forward to viewing your insights and your thoughts and your just wonderful reading and ideas about these different texts. So if you have questions, post in the Q&A discussion area or shoot me an email. But I wish you luck this week. Hang in there. It's important reading, y'all.